Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Alberta pastor Derek Reimer was back in court after being arrested a second time for protesting a drag queen storytime event at a Calgary library. The case involving a Lethbridge father accused of assaulting his baby daughter was back in court today. And with today being St. Patrick's Day, we introduce you to one of the shortest St. Paddy's Day parades in the world.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The Lethbridge father accused of assault in the case involving an infant was back in court earlier today. Angela Stewart has been following this case closely for us and has the latest. Angela, what can you tell us about the father's appearance today?
Yeah, Hal, it was a very brief hearing this morning at the Lethbridge courthouse. The accused did make an appearance. The father, who cannot be named under a publication ban, has been in custody at the Lethbridge Correctional Centre since the start of the case. He did make an appearance via CCTV footage. His defense counsel, Darcy Schertz, requested to have the matter be adjourned for 2 weeks. However, prosecution proposed to have it be put over to next month. The prosecution told the courtroom they don't believe they are ready to move ahead with the file just yet and to require further discussions with defense. On January 18th, Lethbridge police were called to a North Side home after receiving a child abuse tip from the public. It's alleged that a 6-week-old baby girl at the time had been repeatedly abused by her parents. She was taken to Alberta Children's Hospital in Calgary. Her 52-year-old father is being charged with aggravated assault, sexual interference, and failing to provide the necessaries of life. Her 31-year-old mother has been charged with failing to provide the necessaries of life. Both parents are not co-accused and are being charged separately. Now, the mother's case will return to court on March 24th for a bail hearing. The father's matter will return on April 14th. Hal?
Thanks so much, Angela. An Alberta pastor was back in court today after being arrested a second time for protesting a drag queen storytime event at the public library. 36-year-old Derek Reimer was taken into custody on Wednesday near the library for breaching his probation orders that did not allow him to be within 200 meters of any events involving the LGBTQ2+ community. Video of the arrest outside of Calgary's Signal Hill Library went viral. He was charged with 1 count of causing a disturbance and another count of mischief. He also faces 6 other counts of harassment under city laws. Each charge carries a maximum penalty of $10,000. It could also result in up to 6 months in jail for each payment that is not made. Reimer was previously arrested for protesting another drag queen event at the Seton Library in Calgary on February the 25th. Fellow Calgary pastor Artur Pawlowski, who drew scrutiny himself for keeping his church open during the COVID-19 lockdowns, says Canada has an open hatred towards Christianity. Police in Edmonton and across Canada are paying tribute to the 2 Edmonton police officers who were gunned down while responding to a domestic violence call on Thursday. Constables Travis Jordan and Brett Ryan were shot and killed after entering an apartment building to check on a family dispute call. A police source says the shooter was a 16-year-old boy who also shot and wounded his mother. He was later found dead from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His mother, meanwhile, is recovering in hospital. Here in Lethbridge, Police Association President Jay McMillan says there's a special camaraderie amongst police officers and that in Alberta, first responders are particularly tight. He says Thursday was a very tough day for everyone at the LPS.
You know, as soon as it happened, everybody here in Lethbridge who knows somebody in Edmonton was phoning and texting and emailing to make sure that, you know, the people that we know are okay. And, we reach out to the Police Association in Edmonton and make sure that, you know, they've got what they need as far as supports and try to take care of one another as best we can from a distance. But it's shocking. It's horrible. It's devastating for an entire group of people who work together like that on a daily basis. To lose somebody so tragically, they're going to have their work cut out for them. What a tough row to hoe for the Edmonton police here for the next little while. I think it can be really easy at times for members in the community to sort of take for granted the service and the sacrifice of police and of first responders until something like this happens. And then there's a bit of a reminder that there's a significant cost for what we do day in and day out, and the very real threats that we face any given time of any given day And I don't think that can be lost, and it ought not be forgotten.
McMillan adds that calls for domestic disputes are statistically the most dangerous for police officers other than traffic stops. Alberta Premier Daniel Smith delivered a keynote address earlier today at the second annual Premier's Summit on Fairness for Newcomers. Smith says as a province, it's very important to support the talents and experience that so many recent immigrants bring to Alberta.
When newcomers choose to build a future in our province, we need to show you that you are valued. We need to show you that your hard work and dedication will be rewarded and that there is space for your dreams and ambitions here. You should have no doubt that your move to Alberta has been worth the struggle and that this will be the beginning of something great. It is a matter of fairness, but it's also a matter of recognizing the incredible value that new Albertans like you bring to our province. In many cases, we know that you bring advanced professional training and years of experience in fields where Alberta has severe shortages. To leave newcomers unemployed or stuck in jobs for which you are overqualified is a huge burden for you and for your families, but also for Albertans who need more nurses and vets and skilled tradespeople. Together with professional associations, advocacy groups, and newcomers like you, government is working to find efficiencies for everyone's benefit.
Well, that sunshine felt so good earlier today for St. Paddy's Day. Jeanette Rocher is in now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, it must be the luck of the Irish, which gave us that blue sky sunshine and such warm conditions today.
Yeah, definitely. There was a rainbow and pot of gold in southern Alberta today, Hal. And by the way, happy St. Patrick's Day. We saw beautiful conditions reaching up to 7 degrees, so we're well into the pluses. And conditions are going to stay that great and get even better for the weekend. This evening, not looking too bad as well. Clear skies, a 20-kilometer-per-hour wind. We can live with that. Overnight low of -5. And then as we get into Saturday, look at that, double digits, 11 degrees, the expected high with lots of sunny skies. As I look into the future too, I'm seeing no minuses next week, Hal. I'll be back later in the show to give you the 7-day forecast.
That's great news. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced more government funding to address our country's housing shortage. Trudeau says $4 billion will go to local governments to help build 100,000 homes faster over the next decade. Funding for the Housing Accelerator Fund was announced in the 2022 federal budget, but the initiative will run until 2026 and 2027.
Right now, in our biggest cities, in many neighborhoods, it's very hard to build new homes. And it's especially hard to build affordable housing. Whether it's exclusionary zoning, slow permitting processes, or underdeveloped land, the policies in place in many cities are just not producing the housing we need. That needs to change, and that's where the Housing Accelerator Fund comes in. Today, I want to share details of how this fund will help. The Housing Accelerator Fund will accelerate change and eliminate barriers to new housing supply. The federal government will directly fund municipalities that submit action plans for funding. The boldest plans, resulting in the most housing units, especially affordable units, will be rewarded.
Federal Immigration Minister Sean Fraser made an announcement about post-graduation work permits earlier today. Fraser says his government will allow international students an opportunity to gain even more work experience here in Canada.
This initiative will be open to postgraduate work permit holders with expired or expiring temporary status in Canada, and it will allow them to stay longer in Canada and continue to work in Canada. Former international students whose postgraduate work permit expires in the year 2023 will qualify for an additional or extended work permit of up to 18 months. Those who were eligible for the 2022 postgraduate work permit extension will also be qualified for this new measure. Beginning on April 6th, postgraduate work permit holders who are eligible for a simplified, faster process to extend their work permit can opt in using the IRCC Secure account on our website. For those who apply, they will receive by email an interim work authorization, which they can affix to an expired postgraduate work permit that will enable them to work in Canada, and will have 18 months to remain in Canada and continue to work and apply for permanent residency after they receive that work permit.
U.S. President Joe Biden hosted Ireland's Prime Minister at the White House today for St. Patrick's Day. The pandemic scuttled the long-standing St. Paddy's Day meetup 2 years in a row. But as they got together today, both agreed to remain united in their support of Ukraine.
You've been a great friend and a great friend of the United States, and Ireland and the United States share friendship and long, long traditions. And I guess you do know, coming here as many times as you have, how many Americans look forward to St. Patrick's Day. I want to thank you on a substantive matter, standing together on Ukraine. It means a great deal, speaking out against Russia's brutal aggression and our deepening economic ties. We have a lot to talk about.
Really profoundly want to thank you and America for your leadership in relation to Ukraine. I never thought we'd see a war like this happen in Europe in my lifetime. America is at its best when it stands with its European partners to defend freedom and democracy. And thank you for that. And I know you'll stay the course for us, with us, and we'll stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's in connection with war crimes involving children who were allegedly abducted from Ukraine.
Today, 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupying powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. The contents of the warrants are secret in order to protect victims. The ICC attaches great importance to the protection of victims, especially children.
There are concerns that some students in our colleges and universities may be being indoctrinated away from the truth. Now, that's according to Wilfrid Laurier Associate Professor David Haskell. He says some post-secondaries may use identity politics and segregation as a way to help push a certain narrative.
See, one of the problems is our news media doesn't report on this. Yeah. Our news media is complicit. And so as a result, parents tend not to be aware. So unless you're actually looking at the news coming out of the US, you wouldn't be aware at how extensive this critical race theory, this anti-racism education has taken over our schools.
Make sure you catch the full interview with Associate Professor David Haskell and Return to Reason's David Craig by checking out the Return to Reason website or the RTR YouTube channel. Winnipeg's police chief says pandemic-fueled anger was a major factor in the city's record number of traffic deaths last year. Chief Danny Smythe says officers investigated 28 traffic fatalities, including 12 pedestrian deaths last year. That is more than triple the number from 2021. Chief Smythe says there was a lot of anxiety and anger in the community and believes it manifested itself through things like traffic. Winnipeg transportation officials say there were similar increases in fatal collisions in other cities across North America. The governments of Canada and Saskatchewan have announced funding to develop 6 early years family resource centers. They would provide free programming for kids up to the age of 6. Some of the locations include Regina, Saskatoon, Kindersley, and Tisdale. They would also offer support to families with programming services and parent education all under one roof. Education Minister Dustin Duncan says the free walk-in centers will help hundreds of families across Saskatchewan. Well, many in Saskatchewan bleed green for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, but today for St. Paddy's Day, many people were wearing green. Now, to celebrate the special event, residents of the village of Carman Gay, Alberta, hosted the shortest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world. Video journalist Micah Quinn caught up with the parade goers, who are also reflecting on the fire which took down their historic Grange Hotel 2 years ago.
The village of Carman Gay began their St. Paddy's Day parade festivities at 11 a.m. sharp at the post office, and less than 2 minutes later, ended at the site of the historic Grange Hotel. It was built in 1909, but was destroyed by fire in March of 2021. Kim Nichols, the mayor of Carman Gay, says this is the 39th year for the parade, and a few years ago, the Irish Embassy officially recognized Carman Gay as the shortest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world. Nichols explained the challenges the village faced following the destruction of the Grange Hotel.
Last year was tough. Like, we kind of, do you continue? Do you start a new chapter? Like, how do you go on? And so the community decided, let's do this. And it was kind of a healing process, I think, and it shows the resilience of Carmen Gate.
After the parade was finished, everyone headed over to the Carmen Gate Community Centre for some traditional Irish food, drinks, and entertainment. Lynn Johnson, a resident from the town of Vulcan, drove to Carmen Gate just to take part in the parade.
You come out here and there's people come up to me and say, "Oh, good, you're here." And their kids now come, you know, so yeah. And I bring treats.
The parade was a huge hit, especially for 7-year-old Jackson Vance.
It felt a little bit fun and exciting.
According to the Alberta government, as of 2022, the village of Carmen Gate has a population of 281 people, which is an increase of just over 2.5% compared to 2021. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
The students at St. Patrick Fine Arts in Lethbridge took part in a number of activities today, learning all about who St. Patrick was. Now, on top of learning about the famous bishop, the students were able to make some crafts as part of their retreat day.
The kids are doing their retreat activities that they do every year and given the opportunity to really think about how they're showing their commitment through action, through forgiveness, and through prayer. So things that we can all learn and live by. How can they serve God through their hands and the actions that they do? How can they just be kinder to themselves and to one another, anyone that crosses their paths? And then, of course, just that quiet time in prayer, that time where you're growing your own relationship with God. So the hope for them is that through those pieces of commitment, they are stronger for it and better able to just manage whatever comes their way and be more resilient.
School officials say they hope the students can walk away from today remembering the work that was done before them and the example that's been set by St. Patrick. Well, we enjoyed another beautiful St. Paddy's Day across much of southwestern Alberta today, and a nice weekend is also shaping up. A complete look at all of the weather details are coming up. Well, if you're planning a hike through the coulees or perhaps a drive out to Waterton Lakes National Park this weekend, you should be receiving some lovely weather for it. Jeanette Rocher is in now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, it was not only a beautiful weather day for St. Paddy's Day today, but it should also be a great weekend to get out and enjoy the great outdoors here in southwestern Alberta.
Yeah, it absolutely will be, Hal. And what did I tell you? No minuses whatsoever. In fact, we're looking at double-digit temperatures on Saturday with very sunny skies. It's going to be a beautiful weekend. Up to 8 degrees on a Sunday, down to 1 for both Monday and Tuesday, back up to 5 for Wednesday, and then all the way back up to 9 degrees for next Thursday. So I would say it is starting to definitely feel like spring. And by the way, spring solstice does begin next week, so it is about time. Average high for this time of year, 6 degrees. Average low, -6. 19 was our high temperature on this day back in 2007. And in 1943, we had our chilliest, which was -29. 7:41, that is when the sun rose this morning, and our sun set this evening at 7:38. We're so close to that 12-hour mark now, just barely under it. Okay, so looking to the forecast for tomorrow across the nation, 13 degrees the high in Victoria, clearing skies in the morning. Same thing for Vancouver, clearing. 14 the high there, although 17 inland. 4 degrees the high in Edmonton, and the high of 5 degrees in Calgary. Both of those cities sitting under very sunny skies as well. As for the rest of the prairies, sunshine of -3 for a high in Saskatoon, -6 in Regina, and -7 expected tomorrow in Winnipeg. But keep in mind, Regina and Winnipeg, particularly looking at those frost warnings, particularly in the morning with the wind chill value still feeling close to that -30 mark. Okay, looking at a 70% chance of flurries in Toronto, -2 the high there. 0 the high in Ottawa, looking at 2 centimeters of snow, and a mix of sun and cloud tomorrow in Montreal with a high of 2 degrees. As we get over to the Maritimes, looking at the east coast here, Fredericton's high 7 degrees, looking at a mix of snow and showers. Showers expected tomorrow in Halifax with a high of 7 degrees. Charlottetown looking at a mix of snow and showers as well. Could see some freezing drizzle there. 5 degrees the high there, and a high of 2 expected in St. John's, Newfoundland tomorrow. They are under a freezing drizzle advisory, so they could be expecting some of that freezing drizzle, especially in the morning. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Today's weather report is brought to you by Ridge Utilities, providing competitive rates for electricity, natural gas, and internet, while investing back in communities across southern Alberta.
11 of the biggest banks in the United States have announced a $30 billion rescue package for First Republic Bank. It's an effort to stop the California-based bank from becoming the third to fail in less than a week. Shares of First Republic had fallen sharply this week. Shares dropped by more than 60% on Monday alone. For the package, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo would each put $5 billion in uninsured deposits into First Republic. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley would each deposit $2.5 billion, with the remaining $5 billion coming from 5 other banks. A new survey by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce says 1/3 of companies plan to raise prices in the second quarter. Business owners say they face continued cost and labor pressures despite slowing inflation. The report says the retail, accommodation, food services, construction, and manufacturing sectors are the most affected by ongoing price pressures. Most companies with at least 5 employees say they're still concerned about labor shortages. They say they plan to address the issue through higher wages, more flexible work arrangements, and enhanced training. You know, when it comes to conflict in the workplace, it is sometimes attributed to generational differences. That's according to Dr. Tim Elmore, who's the CEO of Growing Leaders and author of the book, New Kind of Diversity. Dr. Elmore says age gaps in the workplace can sometimes cause issues.
I was at a conference just a few years ago that was the impetus for this book. I was talking to CEOs after this event on conflict resolution, and they were still wondering why they were sensing so much conflict when it wasn't between departments or just personnel. And they came to the conclusion that it was the different generations they had on their team. They had Generation Z, they had millennials, they had Xers, they had boomers, they even had a couple of builder generation folks. And it was like an epiphany hit them. That the diversity they were sensing really was the different values and communication styles that these different generations brought to the team.
Make sure you catch that fascinating interview with Dr. Elmore and myself coming up after Business News. Now, here's a look at today's market, which slumped today as investors grapple with the banking fallout and rate uncertainty. The TSX was down 151 points on the day to finish at 19,387. The Dow was down 384 points to 31,861. The S&P 500 was down 43 on the day to 3916. And the Nasdaq was down 86 points to 11,630. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 201 to 66.34 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 16 cents to 235 US. Gold was up 69.73 on the day to 1989.24 US an ounce, and silver was up 91 cents to 22.60 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.21 per bushel, barley's at $8.92, canola's at $17.19, and corn is at $10.49 per bushel. Live cattle April contract was down 3 cents to $162.33. Feeder cattle March contract was down 65 cents to $188.85, and lean hogs April contract was up 43 cents to $79.88. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 72.81 US. Recapping one of our top stories, an Alberta pastor has been arrested a second time for protesting a drag queen storytime event at Calgary's Signal Hill Public Library. 36-year-old Derek Reimer was taken into custody on Wednesday for breaching his probation orders that did not allow him to be within 200 meters of any events involving the LGBTQ2+ community. He was charged with 1 count of causing a disturbance and another count of mischief. He also faces 6 other counts of harassment under city bylaws. He appeared in court earlier today. Coming up, we're going to chat with Justin Thompson, who's the executive director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society, otherwise known as SALT. Mr. Thompson will discuss the importance of conserving land for future generations. Watch the full Q&A with Jeanette Rocher shortly. If you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. Lethbridge College invites everyone to their upcoming Student Research Symposiums taking place March 25th, April 1st, and 13th. Students from their School of Engineering Technologies programs, along with those from Environmental Sciences and Agriculture, will be presenting their capstone projects. Hear and learn from up-and-coming leaders and experts in their fields of studies as they share what they've learned in their programs. All symposiums are free to attend. To find out more and to register, visit give.lethbridgecollege.ca/student research symposiums. Snacks and light refreshments will be provided. The Family Center downtown Lethbridge is providing a weekly opportunity for dads, uncles, and grandfathers to play and connect with their children. Me and My Dad takes place on Saturdays from 10 to 11:30 a.m., featuring fun, brain-building activities for male caregivers to play with their kids. This program is free and open to children under 12. For more information and to register, visit famcenter.ca. And that's today's Bridge City News community calendar.
Land might be the only thing in the world that we can't make more of, and as a result, stewardship of the land is something that's been happening since the beginning of time. So who better to steward the land here in Canada than those who work on the land every day as part of their farming and ranching activities? So to talk more about land stewardship in Alberta, we're bringing in Justin Thompson, the Executive Director of Southern Alberta Land Trust, or SALTS, as it's known. Justin, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, absolutely. So Justin, for those who may not have heard of SALTS here in Alberta, can you maybe give us a brief overview of how your organization cares for the rural and wild lands of Alberta?
Sure. So SALTS is a land trust organization, and we're a bit unique because, as you mentioned, our organization was started by ranchers in Southern Alberta, and our board of directors is still primarily made up of folks who ranch on a full-time basis. And so our focus is really to work with landowners to conserve those private lands in Southern Alberta that are of high ecological value. So wildlife habitat, important watershed areas. And so we do that through a tool called a conservation easement, which has been used now for, I guess, about 25 years in Alberta. And it essentially, in partnership with the landowner, if the landowner wants to see their land conserved, the easement basically puts a set of restrictions on the land that limit certain types of development. So, subdivision, new roads, cultivation, for example, of native grasslands, but really continues to support and encourage land uses like ranching that keep the land intact and support those values like wildlife habitat, like healthy watersheds, and also help to essentially keep the land in agriculture.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you support them, but maybe can you talk about the relationship between SALTS and the farmers and ranchers in Alberta?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we enter into a conservation easement and the landowner decides they want to see their land protected, it's a long-term relationship. The land is protected in perpetuity, but we also work with the landowners. Our landowners typically are already very good stewards. So they're already really interested in maintaining things like range health, riparian health. But we also try to bring extra value to the landowner where we can bring dollars for off-stream watering, fencing projects that help manage the grassland and the habitat. And so we're working with them on an ongoing basis. A lot of these landowners already know how to steward the land really well, but of course the economics of ranching is challenging. And so we try and bring some support to the table to help them do the absolutely best job of stewarding those lands. The big thing we do, though, is the front end, where these important properties that could be converted to a non-agricultural use, like subdivision and development, roads, whatever it might be, the big step is to keep those lands from becoming more fragmented. And so in the case, for example, for Lethbridge specifically, SALTS has done conservation projects with landowners covering about 35,000 acres in the Old Man watershed, which is about 140 square kilometers of land, and that's all upstream of Lethbridge. And a lot of those projects are along rivers like the Old Man or the Crow's Nest, which means those lands are going to keep helping to provide services like clean water, flood mitigation, because when we convert these landscapes to things like houses and roads, of course, the water comes off more quickly, it comes off dirtier. And so we're really trying to maintain things like water quality upstream.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave me some numbers there with some areas around the Old Man watershed and near Lethbridge. Maybe can you give us an idea of the amount of land that's being conserved with salts overall?
Yeah, so actually, because so much of SALT's work is from sort of west of Calgary down to Waterton Lakes National Park, most of our conservation easements are in the Old Man watershed. So again, about 35,000 acres of the land that we've protected is in the Old Man watershed. We've done probably another 10,000 acres outside. But really, that's why I'm excited to talk to you, is that so much of our work really is protecting lands that are of really high value for water and also recreation. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, we're protecting lands that are maintaining those resources, west of Lethbridge. If you start to look at what other land trusts, so there's SALTs, there's organizations like Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, there's other regional land trusts. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres conserved in the Old Man watershed, upstream of Lethbridge. And that is going to be really valuable in the long term to maintaining things like water quality and quantity downstream for the irrigation districts too, right? If we can keep those lands intact so they're providing better water flow throughout seasons and those sorts of things. So a lot of work being done. And I think, we don't do a lot of communications to folks in cities, but a lot of the work that we're doing is really having a direct benefit for cities, even though we're working in these rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so how do you see the mission of SALTs that impacts Albertans and I suppose visitors even to the province as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, even though we're really focused on, how do you maintain healthy grasslands and riparian areas and watersheds, if you start to think of what that means, for example, we've protected a bunch of land along the Cowboy Trail, which means, that's one of the most beautiful highways in my mind anywhere in the world, and it's a real tourism draw. People go down that highway and they're like, isn't this amazing, this big open country, open spaces, no development. So by keeping that as open space, there's tourism value there. Land trusts like SALTs have protected a huge amount of, for example, winter range for deer and elk and moose. So if you're interested as a hunter, we're helping to protect that resource. We've conserved kilometers of land on either sides of rivers, like the Castle, the Old Man, and the Crow's Nest. So if you like fishing, it's preserving those resources. So there's recreation, there's tourism, there's aesthetic resources that are all being conserved on private land that are benefiting Albertans really broadly.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's an education component to SALT. So maybe what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think our biggest effort on the education side is helping people to understand the value of these private lands in Alberta. I think a lot of people think, well, we have our parks, right? We've got our parks in the mountains, and so we've got it all done. But there's a lot of private land outside of parks that we rely on for things like freshwater and wildlife. And so that's our biggest push from an education standpoint, especially in talking to people that live in urban centers, to just help them understand just how valuable these landscapes are. And the other thing we like to help people understand is that, ranching and grazing on our grasslands and foothills is probably the most compatible land use. Those landscapes evolved with grazing by bison, and they actually require grazing in order to maintain biodiversity and the health of the soil. And so a lot of people, I think, have concerns, but don't realize that, in fact, having ranching on those landscapes is probably the most compatible land use if you want to maintain things like water quality and wildlife habitat. So that's another big education piece here, is that, if we remove grazing from that landscape in the foothills and the grasslands, it would actually have a negative effect on a lot of these things that we value.
Wow. So in your mind, Justin, it's important for landowners to participate in the mission of SALT, obviously. Are there risks, though, or downside? Is there a downside for landowners who participate with the land trust?
We do not get involved in the day-to-day management of the land. So really, we're very hands-off. The landowner can continue to manage the land. The land can be transferred to their family. It can be sold. We have no say in that. It's if the landowner's values align with our values, then it's a really good fit. And another big factor here is that salts, when we do these conservation easements, can bring some really important financial incentives to the landowner. Because the landowner is giving up some development rights when they do these easements. And so in return, we can compensate them for that. And we can do that often through a combination of a charitable receipt and some cash payment. And those charitable receipts can often be really helpful to ranchers and landowners who are dealing with the transfer of their land, for example, the next generation. So we can facilitate often the transfer of land between generations and help to avoid big capital gains tax that might otherwise mean they'd have to sell parts of the ranch during that transfer. So, there's a lot of there's the conservation value if the landowners are aligned, and so if there's alignment there, no downsides. We're not involved in the management, and there's also this financial opportunity that can really help families if they're trying to make sure they can continue to ranch.
Interesting. Okay, so Justin, looking ahead a couple of decades, how big of a role does we were talking about Southern Alberta, Lethbridge, how big of a role does the Highway 2 corridor between Lethbridge and Calgary play in the future targets for land stewardship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Highway 2 corridor, has a really interesting mix. Certainly along the east side of the corridor, there's a lot of cultivated land, but there's also some pockets of really important grassland habitat. But west of Highway 2, all along the Porcupine Hills, that is actually to the west of Highway 2, on the east side of the Porcupine Hills, that is one of the biggest remaining blocks of grassland in Southern Alberta. It's one of those places that has not been converted to other land uses. And so that's a really important area for us to try and see, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a watershed, right? Because so many of our creeks and rivers flow off those foothills. And so keeping those foothills intact is really key. And so really we're trying to make sure, land conservation will never protect all the land, and we can't, and we don't intend to, but we're really trying to focus in on those areas of the province that have the highest ecological value, but also going to benefit Albertans long-term down the road in terms of protecting our water and our wildlife resources and our tourism resources. So the Highway 2 corridor is really key. Like I said, west of Highway 2, there's some really, really important land. And then there's also some areas just east of Highway 2, there's pockets of grasslands that are really valuable habitat, especially along our rivers. If we can keep some of that land next to our rivers in sort of a more natural state, it's important. There's so much wildlife, of course, that we know that congregates along rivers. It helps the water quality in the river if there's natural landscapes on either side. There are wildlife corridors up and down rivers, so it's a very important area.
Are there any number of bears or other predatory animals? Are they increasing, to your knowledge?
Yeah, that's a really big, complex question. We have, for a number of years, we've seen a lot more, I think, predators on private lands. We've got a lot of black bears and grizzly bears and cougars in the foothills of Alberta, and they're also moving along those corridors, the river corridors. And so that's been something that ranchers are having to manage. I think there's been more and more effective tools on how we coexist with those predators. And there's been a lot of good work done on how we coexist with those predators, because in the past we would just get rid of them. But I think now we're moving towards a new relationship with a lot of those predators, and I think for the most part the ranching industry is trying to find a balance to coexist.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, here in the southwest corner of Alberta, something also that you see a lot is logging, oil, gas, mining operations in the area. So do you see an increasing relationship between stewarding the land and resource use?
It's a good question. More of the proposals for logging and mining are happening on public lands. And of course, with salts, we're just working on private lands. Conservation easements, if there's existing oil and gas or there's mineral rights holders, conservation easements don't, stop the mineral rights holder necessarily. We try and work with the landowner, and if there's proposals for oil and gas, for example, we try and work with the landowner and the proponent to really minimize the impact to the property from an ecological standpoint. It's not a big part of what we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of new mineral development like oil and gas, and certainly not, forestry or mining on our properties that we work with landowners. It's not a huge factor. I think it is interesting, though, to talk about, the interplay between the private land and the Crown land next door, because we have these proposals sometimes on Crown land, but then, of course, what happens to water and wildlife on Crown land will affect the private land right downstream or right next door. And so where we're working to conserve, private land up and down the foothills, we do want to make sure that's what's happening next door on the public land is making sure that both are complementing each other. So they're related, but we're not seeing that doesn't affect us directly.
Justin, it looks like we're about out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Justin Thompson is the Executive Director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust.
You may have noticed that the North American workforce is experiencing perhaps the most disruptive shift we have ever seen. The pandemic saw millions of people work remotely, and many still do work from home. Now, as employers and employees, how do we address the so-called new normal? Dr. Tim Elmore is the CEO of Growing Leaders, an Atlanta, Georgia-based nonprofit organization created to develop emerging leaders. He's also author of the book called A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. Dr. Elmore, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you, Hal. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you on. Now, how would you best describe your book?
Well, the book really is about the diversity we're seeing, but it's a kind of an elephant in the room. I think we readily talk about ethnic diversity, and we should, and gender diversity and income diversity. But I was at a conference just a few years ago that was the impetus for this book. I was talking to CEOs after this event on conflict resolution, and they were still wondering why they were sensing so much conflict when it wasn't between departments or just personnel. And they came to the conclusion that it was the different generations they had on their team. They had Generation Z, they had millennials, they had Xers, they had boomers, they even had a couple of builder generation folks. And it was like an epiphany hit them. That the diversity they were sensing really was the different values and communication styles that these different generations brought to the team. Well, that set me on a hunt. I was on a search now. How can we better help these organizations, these schools, these nonprofits, these businesses better build bridges between these generations rather than walls, which we tend to naturally build. If we see a young person that is so different and so odd, we tend to just put up walls rather than bridges. So the book is about how do we build bridges rather than walls between these generations.
Now, we'll talk about some of the generational gaps and how we're building the bridges in just a moment here, Dr. Elmore. But let's talk about working remotely as well. Do you find that the millennials were more easily adaptable in that regard than maybe some of the Generation Xers or baby boomers?
Absolutely. In fact, we saw something quite interesting. Yes, they were way more adaptable to the technology that was needed to work virtually, but it was the younger generations, Gen Z and millennials, that were most hungry to come back. And I think it was because they needed to build the social capital that maybe boomers had built for decades already. They were saying, hey, fine, I'm good here. So it was a very interesting mixture of, I know how to do this technology, but I need to be building the social capital that only comes sometimes with face-to-face interactions.
Now, you're right that the generation gap, which is first noticed in the 1960s, has really widened today. And you say it has made collaboration and synergy on a team more challenging than ever. What are some of the bigger challenges that people in the workplace are facing today?
Yeah, well, the best way I can probably respond to this in a short amount of time would be to say, I think the same work that we put into a cross-cultural or cross-cultural interaction is the same work we're going to need to put into a person from a very different generation. So Hal, you and I both know if we got on a plane and flew to China right now, we would psych ourselves up to work hard after we landed at interacting and connecting with those people there, because they speak different language, they have different customs, they have different values. Bingo. I think when I walk into my office and I see a 22-year-old and I'm 62, I got to go, okay, there's going to be some work here. It's worth it, but it's going to be work. And I think sometimes we're just lazy, if I can be honest, socially lazy. Sometimes we have egos that get in the way of our learning from perhaps a person from a very different generation. So the hardships come when we're not really willing to put in the work that we know is necessary to really build that connection.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the term lazy, because in my family, some of the baby boomers look at the millennials as being lazy, unmotivated. What are you contributing to society? Where the millennials look at the boomers and say, yeah, okay, boomer, whatever. You know, so there's that. Almost seems like a disrespect. And us as the Generation X, you know, I've got the millennial kids. I'm like, whoa, easy guys, come on, let's relax here. Like, can't we all just get along? So how do we kind of try and bridge that gap?
Yeah, that is in essence is the issue here. Let me share a quick story. Maggie and Antonio worked together. Maggie is the hiring manager. Antonio was a 24-year-old when this story happened. And he interviewed well. She decided to hire him. He had a great work ethic, it seemed. But Antonio wore a long sleeve shirt that day. And Maggie went through the fact that at this particular company, there were no tattoos allowed. They felt like it might be off-putting to some of their older customers. But Antonio didn't fess up that he had a tattoo. So a few weeks into his job, he's got a short sleeve shirt on, and here's this gigantic tattoo, which you and I would say, okay, that's all right. But Maggie went, why do you have that? Why didn't you tell me at the interview that you had it? Well, suddenly he felt attacked. This is part of my very identity, and oftentimes with younger generations, their look is part of their identity, the piercing, the tattoo. Well, this started a 5 or 6 meeting interaction that did not go well most of the time, because Antonio felt attacked and Maggie felt like he wasn't being honest and it didn't have integrity. But let me tell you why I'm telling you this story. Maggie ended up finding a resolve. She said, Antonio, you're a great worker. I don't want to lose you on this team. But if I just let this go, I'm communicating to every other team member, you have to hold a standard, but Antonio didn't have to hold his standard. And that doesn't work well. So the two of them stood in front of the entire team. Antonio apologized in front of everybody that he had not been forthright and honest and so forth. Maggie said, hey, we all love this guy, don't we? We don't want to lose him. So he agreed to wear long sleeves from that point on. Maggie called corporate headquarters and said, could you consider maybe looking at this policy again? But everybody gave him a standing ovation that they had found a meeting in the middle. Somehow they'd come to some compromise where they were able to still look as though they were doing what they valued, but yet Antonio got to stay. I'm bringing this up because I think far too often we come to this divide where we feel like we're violating a principle, perhaps, or some core thing. And if we are, we shouldn't violate it. But Maggie put relationships first, and she found a way where both parties could actually work together in this setting. I think that's what we're going to have to do more and more as time marches forward.
So what are some of the key questions leaders really need to be asking at better closing the generation gap outside of, do you have any ink?
Yeah. Well, there's a few that I've been having to ask. I am in my 60s now, and so my career started more than 40 years ago. I would say one question is, am I willing to be a mentor? Now, that's not a real word. It's a combination of mentor and intern. So am I willing to pour into this generation that perhaps needs some timeless values and skills, but am I willing also to put that intern hat on when I need to learn something that I haven't picked up in the last 40 years, but it's new today, and they know it intuitively? So that would be one. Am I willing to be a teacher and a learner? And I love the term. Chip Conley came up with this term years ago, mentor. I feel like maybe that's the tip of the iceberg where every other question is going to fall under. Am I teachable, even as an older veteran of the workforce?
You know, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've been in this crazy industry over 30 years as a broadcast journalist. I work as the news director here, and I learn a lot from our young journalists that are coming through college, things that they can teach me, and at the same time, I can share some of my experiences with them.
Right. I love that.
How can a leader really connect employees in a way that will allow that really to happen, that we can learn from each other and keep those doors open?
Yeah. So the number one enemy of what you just asked, Cal, is stereotyping. We don't know that we do it, but we naturally do it. Our brains create files. We have to have files to keep everything in order up there. So we see someone say a particular phrase or do a certain activity, and we go, I know what you are. I know who you are. And we stereotype. So to fight that, I've got 3 simple but big ideas. The first one is humility. I have to approach every interaction with any age with humility. That means I can speak as if I believe I'm right, but I must listen as if I believe I'm wrong. That's huge for me. That's a game changer when I meet with 20-somethings or 30-somethings. So number 2 is respect. I know that's an age-old term, and you folks in Canada seem to do it better than we in America, but I think we've just got to exude and find ways to demonstrate I respect you, even though I'm very different than. We don't have to not be different. Difference is beautiful. We need the differences, but I need to respect you. And then the third big idea is curiosity. If I can stay curious into my 40s and 50s and 60s, oh my gosh, that keeps me in a different frame of mind. And I'm ready to hear from anybody and everybody along the way to get better. So those would be the concepts that I would share on that one.
Do you find sometimes, too, with the generational gap that it's harder sometimes for people to agree to disagree?
Yeah, no doubt about it. And we're in a very difficult time right now where we're just polarized, it seems like, on so many issues. It's unnecessary. So yeah, I think that, here's my theory. I think the generation gap has gotten bigger, not just because of the polarization, but because the screens in our life went from public to private. So when I was growing up, there was one screen in our house. It was a TV. We all gathered around and watched we called it a program together, and we laughed together, listened together, talked about it afterwards. But today, we've got this smart device in our hand, and it's a private thing. I've got an echo chamber, and I'm interacting with people that are probably my age, that think like me, vote like me, and it's not helpful. So once the screens went to private, now we've got these silos we've got to break out of, and it's going to require that work that I described earlier, that we're going to have to reckon I'm willing to do that work.
So what can we really learn from each other to help us grow as individuals, right? Now, John Maxwell has said before that managers treat everyone the same, but leaders treat everyone differently. Tell me about this idea of chess versus checkers in leadership and how that really plays into the way that leaders should treat other people.
Yeah. So in this book, I offer 6 metaphors or 6 images that start conversations. We believe pictures really are worth 1,000 words. So chess and checkers are both games that are played on the very same game board. So we could be tempted to think, must be the same game. Not true. When I play the game of checkers, all my pieces look alike, they all move alike, so I treat them all alike. In chess, if I have any hope of winning the game, I have to know what each piece can do. That a knight goes up 2 and over 1, and a bishop does this, and a pawn, and a rook, and a king, and a queen. Only in knowing the strength of each piece can I win. I think mediocre leaders, parents, managers play checkers with their people. They treat them all alike, and they get average performance. Great leaders do the work to play chess in the relationships of their life, and they connect with others at the uniqueness of their strength, their personality, and their generation. And those people flourish under the leadership. By the way, isn't this true in our homes? If we have more than one child, they're probably very different, even though they're eating the same meals under the same roof. We've got to play chess rather than checkers. So that's a big idea that I think will enable us to connect with the different generations around us.
How about building up team morale, maybe doing some team bonding and trying some interesting activities that will really close the generation gap on a team? Any suggestions?
Yeah, sure do. One is finding someone that you know is very different. Let's say a different generation, 20-something, I'm 50-something or 60-something. And I play the game. Well, it's not a game, but it's just an interaction called Tell Me About Your Superpower. I have noticed that all generations bring different strengths to the team. Think about it. The boomer generation brings stories and experience and coaching that they have to offer. Xers bring this pragmatism that they got when they were growing up in a very difficult time in the 70s and 80s. Millennials bring this confidence with them and this hope and idealism. Gen Z brings this hacker mindset and this entrepreneurship that they bring with them as a generation. So if I ask the question, well, first, let's swap stories. We're going to find something common. in our stories somewhere, but then share with me your superpower and I'll share with you mine. Almost always those superpowers are derived from who we are and the generation from which we come. So that would be one activity that I think has really helped us at Growing Leaders. We're doing that here, and it's been so fun to see people get to know each other in an unusual way and then glean from each other.
So what's your superpower?
Well, I think mine really is the coaching that I bring. My brain has gone from fluid to crystallized, and this is the 43rd year of my career. So I can tell you back here, this is what we learned from this, and back here is what we learned from that. And I think now, instead of just being a history teacher in my office, I've got to be the one that says, let me give you a couple of really good questions to ask, because we did try that in 2004, and here's what happened. But yet I don't want to rain on the parade. You know how that goes. It's, well, we tried that and it didn't work, so forget it. So I think that's kind of mine. Now, we're obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, one of my favorite practices, Hal, is reverse mentoring. Reverse mentoring is a topic that Jack Welch brought up at General Electric way back in the 1990s. This is where an older generation person and a younger generation person get together. They do swap stories, but this time they're each going to mentor each other in what they bring to the table. So the senior veteran's going to say, here's how to succeed at this organization. I've learned it. But the young person may say, here's how to monetize the latest app I just got on my phone, or how to use it for marketing at this company. And I have no idea how to do that. So like you learn from those younger if you're open. And I'm telling you, reverse mentoring, every week I sit at that table to my left, and I'm meeting with Andrew, who's 30 years younger than me. I'm meeting with Cam, who's 40 years younger than me. And I learn every single time.
Yeah, you keep learning and you keep growing. I love that. Dr. Tim Elmore is the author of A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. Thanks so much for joining us today from Atlanta, Georgia.
Thank you, Hal. It's great to be with you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks for watching.